Beethoven wrote only one opera, Fidelio. It cost him more energy and heartache than any other piece, going through many revisions and changes. And nothing demonstrates this struggle more clearly than the 4 separate overtures Beethoven wrote for it. Originally entitled Leonore, after the opera's leading lady, Beethoven found his first attempt at an overture, Leonore No. 1, too short to bear the weight of the opera's drama. So he wrote a second, now referred to as the Overture to Leonore No. 2, which we'll play in these concerts. But during rehearsals, some of the wind players found No. 2 too difficult, so Beethoven composed the piece again. The new version, now referred to as Leonore No. 3, is the most popular. But in his enthusiasm, Beethoven overwrote it, and it turned into a tone poem rather than an overture, too long for an operatic performance. So finally, Beethoven wrote a much shorter overture, named the Overture to Fidelio, his new name for the opera, and this is now played at opera performances. Got it? So what about Leonore No. 2, which we will perform in these concerts? Well, it's like a condensed version of the opera, telling the main parts of the story, condensed in 13 minutes. In this way, it was quite new. Opera overtures usually just fired up the audience before the curtain rose. First, we meet Florestan, a man who has been wrongly imprisoned for political reasons. From his dark, damp cell, he dreams of his wife, Leonore, and remembers the springtime of their love. This launches us into a retelling of the opera's drama, culminating in a trumpet call from far away. Florestan's wife, Leonore, has dressed up as a man, Fidelio, in order to rescue Florestan from imprisonment. Her trick works, and Florestan is released. The music turns up to warp speed as Florestan celebrates his release and his beloved, faithful wife. Love has saved the day. Although less frequently performed than No. 3, No. 2 is my favorite of the 4 overtures. I'm in agreement with the great Polish composer Witold Lutosławski, who referred to No. 2 as the best 13-minute piece ever composed. Lowell Liebermann is one of America's most frequently performed and recorded living composers. He's an artist who writes unashamedly for the pleasure of the audience, and his new organ concerto, which will receive its first performances in these concerts, is no exception. It's a grand and thrilling work that harnesses the unique power and color of the organ while drawing on its rich history. Each of the 4 movements has a title that reaches back into the organ's past repertoire. The first, Chorale Prelude, is named after the form beloved by J.S. Bach, in which the organ improvises on a hymn tune. The atmosphere is stern and gothic and tremendously exciting, with the full power of the organ unleashed. Then comes a wild and rather macabre dance, followed by a mournful aria, and finally a toccata, again one of Bach's favorite forms. This finale is exhilarating. It's one massive accelerando, that is, the music starts slowly and over the course of 6 minutes gets faster and faster, ending in a blaze of triumph. We welcome one of the world's great organists and musicians, Paul Jacobs, to perform this glittering new concerto, brought to life for the very first time by our spectacular Brian concert organ. Whenever I'm asked the impossible question, what's your favorite symphony? I usually refuse to answer, but inside my head a voice always cries out, Schumann's Second! Chronologically his third, it was begun in 1845, shortly after Schumann had recovered from a nervous breakdown. I find it endlessly fascinating, haunting, heartbreakingly tender and beautiful, but most of all thrilling and life-affirming, for it is a piece about an artist triumphing over his inner adversity. Robert Schumann was the archetypal romantic. He loved poetry as much as music, couldn't decide whether to be a musician or a writer. married another artist, the great pianist Clara Wieck, struggled with depression, had a ferocious sexual appetite, often stayed up for days at a time writing music, and died in an insane asylum from pneumonia after contracting syphilis. If that sounds frenetic, it's because Schumann was, especially when composing the Second Symphony. While writing it, Schumann wrote to his colleague Mendelssohn, "For several days there's been much trumpeting and drumming within me." We meet this trumpeting in the slow introduction to the first movement. Measured and almost religious in character, the introduction begins with the trumpets playing gentle fanfares. And already we can sense ambiguity because fanfares are usually loud, not hushed. Schumann referred to the first movement as moody and refractory. This description is puzzling since the music is mainly joyful and energetic. But the clue lies in a remarkable passage about 2/3 of the way into the main allegro. As often with Schumann, the entire movement is based on one small rhythmical motive, a technique learnt from the Beethoven of the Fifth Symphony. In Schumann's hands, the rhythms are obsessive and claustrophobic. Starting softly, the orchestra repeats this motive for several minutes, gradually rising in pitch, the harmony becoming painfully dissonant. There's a growing sense of panic, as if the walls are closing in around us. Just when the tension has become unbearable, the trumpets come crashing in with the pure joy of C major, the home key of the symphony. Schumann has composed a nervous breakdown right in the middle of the movement, and he has survived, but at great cost. The second movement is famously virtuosic, its endless run of 16th notes nearly always used as an excerpt in violin auditions. Again, there's an obsessive element, but this time hearty and rambunctious, balanced by two beautiful trios. In the first, the woodwinds chatter away gregariously, while the second finds a place of deep spiritual calm and contentment. Switching the usual order of the middle movements, Schumann places the slow movement third. This adagio is the romantic slow movement par excellence. Over a pulsing heartbeat in the lower strings, the violins spin an aching melody. Starting rather calmly, this is music of a less manic, sadder yearning. Owing much to the Beethoven of the Seventh Symphony, it builds to an inexorable climax of passionate longing. The finale begins with a great flourish and much excitement. Schumann wrote that he was himself again, having suffered another minor breakdown after completing the third movement. The finale begins as a march, a metaphor for the composer's victory over the sickness of the previous movement. But before long, the spiritual tone that pervaded the second trio of the scherzo comes back. I always find myself close to tears as the music progresses, for it moves from the joyfully mundane to an expression of the ineffable and the sublime. Now, when the trumpet fanfares return, they seem to come from the spiritual contentment of heaven, and all memories of the previous movement's conflicts are subsumed in an eternal joy and rest. Schumann being Schumann, the symphony ends with all guns blazing. But we're left with a sense of triumph very different from that which we experience at the end of Beethoven's Fifth or Seventh. In confronting and banishing his inner demons right in front of us, Schumann has taken us out of the everyday into a place of timeless nirvana.